Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For our free wire tutorial here on YouTube today, we're going to learn to make this guitar tree of life pendant. Well, let's head down to the board and take a closer look. So we have a number of sections that we're going to complete bit by bit, and then we shall bring it all together. So why don't we start with the frame itself? Now, you can absolutely be inspired by whichever guitar shape you like. I've got this really old coaster that you can probably see coffee stains on and dog hair. And I'm probably going to go for a classic single cut Les Paul shape, but you can be inspired by whichever guitar shape you prefer. So like I said, we'll begin with the frame and we'll take it from there. So for a piece of this dimension, let me just grab a ruler. This is around about 5.5 inches in length. We're going to begin with a 14-inch length of quite heavy wire. Now I'm going to be using 1.25mm, which is equivalent to 16 gauge. And we're going to start by giving that a really hearty warm through. The better the shape you make in the very beginning of the design, the happier you'll be at the end. You can of course make small adjustments as you go through, but I do like to start out as I mean to go on. So let's get this wire nice and warm. This is quite heavy wire and it's also very cold here today, so it's a little bit unwilling to do things. So we'll start off by making a roundish form down at the bottom, and then we'll kind of adjust that by hand as we go. So I'm going to use, I think, probably my largest mandrel, which is 1 inch 25mm, and just get a roundish form in the centre bottom of that wire. Doesn't matter if it's not precise, we've got enough wire to play around with a little bit. So I'm just going to roll that around so it's more of a circular form, and then I can open that up to adjust for the fact I didn't get it dead centre. So what we will do then is just kind of start opening that up and see how that feels. If it's not right, you can have another go. I don't want to spend too much time on it now because it's very boring for you as a viewer to see that, but obviously the more time you spend getting it right, the better it will be for you. So we'll give that a bit of a wiggle and make sure that we're happy with the basic starting out point. Overall, I'm reasonably happy with that. Like I say, you can take a little bit more time. So let's bring those ends over to create the waist of the guitar. If you're going for that kind of Les Paul shape, or even if you're going for a super strat shape, you can adjust it when you get up to the horn and the upper side of the guitar as well. So, like I said, you can be inspired by this, but go whichever way you desire. So to create that very, very elegant waist on the Les Paul shape, I'm going to grab another beadle on wood mandrel, and I'm just going to pop that in the side there and rotate the wire out. You could use the same kind of design to make a violin if you wanted to. So again, on the other side, we just make that waist shape, and then we'll take it from there. Obviously that's very, very narrow at the moment, but it gives us an opportunity just to see how we feel and to make sure that we're getting on okay with that shape and form. I think probably what I'm going to do is play around with that just a little bit. So I've just taken a few seconds to adjust that ever so slightly, and I'm a little bit more happy with it. It's just a case of making teeny tiny adjustments as you go through. What I don't want to do is to make you bored. So the next thing we're going to do is to make the upper side of the body of the guitar, or the horn on this side, as I'm going for that single cut. And I'm going to again use that same size mandrel. You could use whatever round form you have around the home, just to get that shape to begin with, and I'll make the same on the other side. Now let's give that a little bit of a swoop around, pull that over the top, and they need to be reasonably evenly matched. Let's pop that back out of the way. And then it's a case of my favourite thing, which is eyeballing it, just kind of going by feel. If you wanted to be a bit more precise, you can absolutely print out an image and then take it from there. You can just kind of lay your wire down on the image and make sure that you're precise and that all of your angles and dimensions are correct. But for me, I'm just going to pop my chain nose pliers underneath like so, pull that back on itself to get a nice sharp shape, and then I probably just use my finger to get that little curve coming back towards the neck section. So again, take your time. You can take a lot more time than I am just to get that to be as perfect as possible. And then once you're happy with how that looks, like I say, do take your time, don't rush it. And we'll bring that around and up towards the neck. What we will do then is just refine the angle just here to make sure that we get a good straight line coming up and away from the centre of that body. On the other side, if you are going for the single cut, you're just going to come all the way over the top, kind of matched to where that horn is on the right hand side as we're looking at it, the lower side of the guitar. And we'll just grip that very, very firmly and push the wire up and away. Now, it doesn't need to be exactly precise, but you do need to allow yourself space for those 6 strings, unless you're doing a bass, of course. So just allow that to sit approximately where you want it to. And then pull those 2 sides of the neck of the guitar away from you, just to get some warmth and give you an idea of how things are starting to look. Overall, I'm reasonably pleased with that. Do take your time and make sure that you're happy with the shape you've created, because it does become increasingly difficult after the event to just make those refinements. If you need a little bit of manoeuvrability, then I'm sure you'll be able to work that out. Let's just give that a little bit of a tweak. And bring that up slightly, and then straighten up the neck of the guitar. So when you're working with a slightly heavier wire, it's much trickier to get it to sit exactly how you want it to. But once it's there, it's much more likely to stay there, which, as far as I'm concerned, in jewellery or art that you're going to hang on the wall, can only be a good thing. So let's just make that nice and straight. Now, I have brought in my big block from the garage to do some hammering on this frame in a little while, but let's just go up towards the top. Now, where I've added strings across the guitar, what you will notice is that they go across at an angle. Now, normal guitar strings don't do that, so it's a bit of a let me have some artistic license, and that's what we've done. I used to have a very wonderful friend, Anders Tidell, who's sadly no longer with us, and he instigated something called the True Temperament guitar, which had wonderful wiggly waggly lines where the frets are based, just to give you a beautiful sound. It's like an Eastern temperament sound. It's absolutely stunning. So it's a bit of artistic license, both with the angle of those lines and also the number of them. It would be a very short scale guitar if that was real. You can obviously try to rack in 22 or 24 of those string frets if you want to. It just gets a little bit tricky. So as I said, it's an artistic license guitar, and that's something for you to bear in mind when you're making your shape. It doesn't have to be perfect. People will recognise that it is indeed a guitar, and perhaps that it is inspired by the fabulous Gibson Les Paul. Let's give that a bit of a squish and a squash. Get that as straight as possible. So it's just an inspired by and a little bit of an artistic representation. So the next thing that we're going to do is to make the wood that is part of the neck flare out to become the headstock of your guitar. So I think around about here will be right. You can obviously make it much smaller or much larger. And to begin with, I'm just going to put 2 right angles at the same distance. So just keep an eye on that, make sure that they're relatively even to begin with. You can move that ever so slightly if you need to. So once I've got those 2 right angles, I'm just going to give them a teeny tiny bit of a squish to make sure that they're good and strong before I start manoeuvring them about. Now, the wonderful world of guitars, there is so many different headstock shapes. You can really have lots of fun. You go for the reverse hockey stick headstock. Do whatever you want, really. Have some fun with the design. So we're going to now bring the wire back in. And what I like to do is just to curve that out ever so slightly. And because we warmed that wire first, you should be able to get that little bit of curvature. Let's flip the design over. And again, trying to keep these similar in terms of their dimension for this particular guitar. But it doesn't have to be. You know, this is an inspired by. And if you go slightly wrong, oh well. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to. Give that a squish. And then another little bit of a curvature. Now, what I tend to do with this design is a little bit of a double crossover up at the top, like so, which we will then wire in my add a bail technique. If you want to wear this as a pendant, you absolutely can, but you could, if you wanted to, just wire those 2 top sections together. So what we do is just cross the 2 wires over at the top to form the very, very tip of that headstock. So let's estimate the size of the headstock that we want. This looks reasonable to me. Push the wire over. I'm going to make mine ever so slightly pointed at the top. So going up and then back down, and I'll trim that away in just a second. That's the general idea. So again, gripping on the other side at approximately just a tiny bit higher. We're going to go about 1 millimetre higher on this side. Doesn't matter which side round that happens. And it's just so that we can double up on those wires up at the top. So where I have on the right hand side a bend going upwards, I'm going to have it just ever so slightly higher on the left hand side so that I can wire that together securely later. And again, you will need to just grip your wire, estimating where you'll need to do that. There's a reasonable crossover point just there. Now you can, of course, trim just one of these sides and then take this longer side to make a loop, or you could add on a bail. So that's really exactly what you want to do with the design. I'm just giving you the inspiration here to work with. Now that's a very narrow neck at the moment, so what I'll probably do is just widen the body up a little bit, just to make sure that I can get my set of 6 strings in. Of course, you could always make it a base. And I might have a look at that little area. I think that might be just slightly too wide. Looks like it's coming out a little bit too far. It doesn't look too bad up that way. But anyway, before you make the cut of the wire up at the top, do make sure that you are indeed happy with how that all looks. So for today, I am going to do the add a bail technique, but please do bear in mind that you have the opportunity to reserve one of these extra bits of wire just up at the top and make your own variation of a hanging loop, or indeed a bail if you prefer. Right now, I'm just going to trim this away. So let's flip that over so I can get my flush cutters in. That looks about right to me. Winging it as usual. And as long as there's some crossover, you will be able to securely wire those 2 sections together. You also have the opportunity of bringing that down the side if you want to. As kind of a signature, you could even bring it around in a coil over the top of the guitar to hide where our strings attach. So I might just leave that one on for now and we'll see how we go. The next thing that I would do is to hammer that to make sure that it is good and strong. So let's just give me a few minutes to make sure that I'm happy with the shape, and then I will hammer that with you. So I've just spent a couple of moments making sure that I'm happy with the overall shape and form, and now I'm just going to do a little bit of light hammering. I have a large block and my standard chasing hammer. The only thing I'm not going to hammer is this tail of wire on the end, because I haven't decided what I'm going to do. So when you're hammering a form which is springy like this, before you start, just make sure that the whole thing is sitting how you want it to end up. You might need to support that with tape or with another set of fingers, or get some help, however it works for you. Just make sure everything is exactly where you want it to be. And then just work your way round. Because I don't want you to get bored, I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but whenever you're hammering any part of it, make sure if it's springing away from its final position, that you hold it in that final position whenever you hammer any part of it. So I'll just hold that headstock together at the top and do a little bit of the neck, and then we can get back to doing the body, and then we will move on. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but what you'll find is that it will come together, and by the time you've got all the way around, you will be able to just lay that down and it won't be quite so springy anymore. I did prepare one earlier on to show you what it looks like when it's been fully hammered. That's upside down. There we go. So that's been hammered all the way around, and it now sits exactly how I want it to. So before we move on to the next stage, I'm just checking that I've hammered all the way around and I'm happy with the rigidity of this piece. Just to make our life easier, I'm going to use a scrap piece of wire. This is 0.4 or 26 gauge. And I'm just going to tie the top bit loosely together. We will make a much tidier job of this later. This is just to hold the piece in position whilst we do some of our other work on this design. So for the next part of our tutorial today, we're going to need to make the string assembly and attach it to the frame of the guitar. So let's head down to the board and talk materials. So we're going to begin with a piece of wire which is going to act as our bridge. Now I'm just using a scrap, but I would say allow between 2 and 3 inches of either your 1.25mm 16 gauge. I've just got a scrap here of 1mm or 18 gauge. Now it's going to end up across the body of the guitar like this, and it's a very simplistic way of attaching the bridge to the guitar. Because we're going to cover it up later with our tree design, it doesn't really matter that it's a bit basic. However, if you want to be inspired, I did a slightly more fancy variation on this guitar, which is where I created this wiggly waggly kind of M shape and wired that separately to the frame of the guitar, and that's where the strings are attached. That forms the bridge of the guitar. However, for today's tutorial, we're just going to go for a short straight piece of wire and attach it across the body. We'll hide it later with some tree foliage. So this can be, as I've mentioned, 1.25/16 or 1mm 18 gauge. The strings, now I played around with the wire for the strings several times. I tried 0.6mm, which is 22 gauge, 0.7mm, which doesn't really have a gauge alternative, and 0.8mm, which is 20 gauge. Far and away the winner is 0.8mm 20 gauge. Now the reason for this is it enables us to wire on our frets later on. However, it's a little bit tricky to get started, but once you've got the strings onto the bridge, it's absolutely wonderful. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to work from my reel of wire. So this is 0.8mm 20 gauge, and you'll need approximately 6-inch lengths times the number of strings that you want. So I'm just going to get that warm to begin with, and we're going to apply them to just off to one side of the centre. I've got a little bit of residue, about 1/2 inch over the top, and I'm just going to bend that around the bridge to begin with. A sharp bend, you could use banding pliers if you wanted to, just to begin with, all the way around like a hook. And then I'm going to bring that tail all the way over the top, and we're trying not to bend that bridge too much. You could hammer the very middle section but not the ends if you wanted to. And we're looking for 2 wraps with that 0.8 or 20 gauge wire, and I'm just going to tighten that up as much as I can. So I'm just going to put my pliers across that second coil to tighten it up, and then across both of them to tighten it up, and then I'm just going to cut away that end section, pop it in the scrap pot for later, and then make sure that the very end is tucked around neatly. Now we will need to straighten these strings or these wires up later, and you do need to make sure that that end section isn't sticking out. So this is really the only tricky part, just trying to get that end tucked neatly against the coil and then nice and tight. And you're going to do that 6 times in a row, all without bending your bridge too much. So there's merits to using that heavier wire, or let me just slide that out of the way for a moment. You could harden the central section of that bridge, just twist it around, get it nice and straight, and add your 6 strings. Once you've got that length to around about 6 inches, or at least enough to travel the whole length of the body of the guitar, because it gives us enough to wire onto the headstock later. Give yourself that length 6 times over. We'll meet back and move on. So once you've got all of your 6 strings attached, what you need to ensure is that you've got 1.5 wraps on each of those wires attached to the bridge. Make sure that they're evenly spaced. You can tighten them up slightly by just crossing over with the tips of your chain nose pliers. So one on the right hand side at the top, one on the left hand side at the bottom. Compress that spring down and then reverse to do the other side. And don't be afraid here to give that a little bit of a squish once you're sure everything is looking nice and equal. So it definitely pays to harden the central third of that bridge wire, just to make sure it's easier for you to control everything. You may still get a bit of movement on those strings, but we are going to ensure that they stay together in the next step. So another thing that you can do to help this go ever so slightly easier is to find yourself a set of nylon jaw pliers and just make sure that those strings sit side by side and smooth that wire away. We don't really want to over harden the very tops of the strings at this point because we'll need them to be a little bit flexible, firm but flexible. So you can do that a number of times, just making sure that everything is next to each other, not crossing over, and you get a nice straight effect. But don't worry too much. Obviously there are some slight undulations at the moment. We'll work on that when we start adding those frets. Now the fret wire I'm going to be using is from the reel, and I'm going to be using some 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire. Every wire I've used today is a raw copper, and what I'm going to do is just check that I'm on the upper side of the bridge. So the finer strings, the 0.8 20 gauge, is coming over the top of that bridge wire, and I'm going to attach the very end of my fine wire now all the way around next to one side of the strings. So I think I'll probably get 3 rotations of wire. Doesn't really matter, it's all going to be covered up with tree later. So let's get that nice and tight. Make sure there's no sticky outy bits. Doesn't really matter if it's slightly imperfect. So what we're going to do is to scooch that so it sits against one of the ends of those strings. It doesn't matter if you work in the opposite direction. And what we're going to do is to bring this just a little way along that first string and draw it underneath. Now what I'm going to do to keep that next to the first string is just pinch it slightly. Draw that first string away, and I'm going to draw the tail that's attached to my reel up between string 1 and string 2, and just draw that all the way around once. So it's come underneath, upwards and around, and then underneath again. So if I bring the second string into position, feels a bit fiddly to begin with, but it will start to come together once you get further up that neck of the design. So I'm going to bring the wire, the 0.4 26 gauge, up now between 2 and 3 string. Pull that firmly down into position, and then draw that tail of wire down between 1 and 2. So what you're getting is a little bit of a wrap on the first string, then on the second string. And then we're going to bring that tail of wire down underneath string number 3, and then bring it up between 3 and 4, push it into position, take it down between 2 and 3, making sure that you don't accidentally get it wrong, push that all the way down. Every time you make a little wrap, push that into position. Don't worry about this little fella, we're going to tighten that up later. And then we'll bring the tail of the wire down underneath string number, in this direction that we're moving. It needs to be coming underneath number 4, between 4 and 5, and then all the way around string number 4. So down between 3 and 4, push it down into position. Then we're going to push up string number 5 in the direction that we're moving, bring the tail of the wire up between 5 and 6, pull that into position, and then bring that wire down between 3 and 4, no, 4 and 5, I forgot where I was going then. Push that all the way down, and you're getting a relatively straight line on this design. And then we're going to wrap all the way around string number 6 by itself. Push that down into position. Now once you've got that, you can see that that's our first fret, all ready and done. So this has gone baggy because I pinched it. That's absolutely fine. If you want to move that down a bit, you absolutely can. And in order to tidy this little sticky outy bit, looks like a little bit of wiring has gone awry, what you can do is just twist that tail section around. This is all going to be covered up by tree, but if you want it to be a little bit neater, just rotate that coil around until you've eaten up all of that spare wire. So let's rotate all the way around until that's nice and neat and tidy, and then you can just push that down so that it sits neatly against that first string. Now, moving on to the second fret that we're going to add on, I'm just going to flip this over so we see the underside of the design, and we're just going to draw that wire across diagonally. Now at this stage you might like to take a moment just to separate those strings, to draw them out into nice straight lines. You could just splay them ever so slightly outwards. We're going to come across at a diagonal, Flip it back over to the front again, and we're going to do exactly the same thing again. So we need to come up between 1 and 2. And then just repeat exactly the same thing over and over again. So on a usual guitar, the frets get a little bit closer together the closer they get to the bridge. So you can do that if you want to, or you can have them evenly spaced. It's absolutely up to you. It's just kind of an inspired by. So I'm going to wrap all the way around string number 2 again. And then you can just repeat exactly as you did on that first section. Come up on the underside again at a diagonal, and you'll be able to set your frets exactly where you want them to. And we're just going to approximate where we're going to put the bridge, which will probably be around about there. But because we want the tree to have a nice long trunk, I'm going to just use my artistic license and sit that a little bit higher. And then you'll stop with your frets just before you get to the headstock. So in order to make my life slightly easier, I've splayed the ends of those string wires out so that it's easier for me to decide where the gaps are. Just keep going until you reach the point at which your string section will cross over into the headstock. Once we get to the point that we've got enough frets to fill that neck, what we're going to do is just a couple of basic ways of finishing off the wiring. To start with, we're just going to wrap twice around that topmost string as we're looking at it, just to make sure that we're happy with how everything is sealed off. And then I'm drawing that wire across the back underneath, and I'm going to now wrap twice around the lowest string as you're looking at it. And because you've not got any wraps in the way, you can get those to sit symmetrically opposite each other, which just kind of gives it a finishing look to that set of frets. I'm overall quite happy with where that sits in the body of the guitar. So what I'm going to do now is bring that finer gauge wire all the way over the top, wrap around just that topmost string, take it around underneath and wrap once just here as well. And that just gives the look of the nut, which is the bit at the top of that fretboard. And what we're going to do is flip that over and trim away really close to that design. Let's get that finer gauge wire out of the way. And then just make sure that everything is nice and neat and tidy. Get that last little bit of string tucked away as neatly as possible. And I know that I always say don't press down where strings cross over, but today we're just going to make sure everything is super tight, super straight and super neat before giving it one very gentle little squish with your chain nose pliers. So let's have a look at how that is working. That I think is going to be fine. Now I did just want to talk to you about the fancy way that you can set the bridge into the guitar if you want to. I made this funky M shape because it reminded me of a particular guitar which has something very similar like that coming away from the bridge. But today we're just going to go for a straight line, and it's perfectly acceptable because we're going to be covering this with a Tree of Life design later. So what we need to do is to make sure that that last straight line we added sits right at the angle change into the headstock of the guitar. Make sure that you're overall happy with how everything looks, and then we're going to start by folding around that bridge wire, making sure that the strings sit centrally on the body and that they will fit inside the lines that you created for the neck of the guitar. And to begin with, I'm just going to push that around either side, just so that I've got pretty much a place marker of where that sits. Now, one of the reasons I use a heavier wire for the frame and hammer it is because it's very easy to deform the whole thing when you do this maneuver. So do take your time, go steady, and all we're going to do is just across the back. If I flip the piece over, exactly the same on the other side. Now you can do something much more fancy if you want to, but all I'm going to do today is to trim that with a couple of millimeters of wire to spare. Make sure you trim the right side, otherwise it's really depressing to have to do all that again. And then we're just going to keep that fret section set inside the body, making sure that you've set it the right way up if you're looking for a right-handed single cut. Obviously, if you want a southpaw and you're going to be using it that way, then it's absolutely fine. But make sure it's all the right way up, and then just get that to sit as neatly as possible. Trim away that second half, again, making sure that you're only trimming the correct piece of wire. I've got a couple of mil to spare just there. And then what we're going to do is to fold that around the frame that we made in that guitar body shape. So just push very, very softly until that closes up. If you get into trouble, take your time, go back a step, and just make sure that you're happy with how it sits before you move on. So I've just looped around, and once we've added the tree and once we've wired the guitar strings in up at the top, that will be fine. Your other alternative is to bring that last little tail, that last little bit just here, bring that around and sit it onto the body of the guitar as well. Soft little movements, soft little movements, soft little movements. And then you know that that's going to be nice and secure. So once we start adding in the tree over the top of that design, everything's going to be wonderful. So let's just flip that over to the face. What we can do now is to start pulling those strings out to the side. And then just give yourself a gap. You could use a plier, but I'm just going to use the tip of my nail to get those to cascade outwards over the side. And again, so many different guitars. Some of them have 3 strings on either side. Some of them have 6 strings all going to the same side. Some of them are really quite unusual. So do be inspired by whatever your favourite guitar is. Let's add a little bit of warmth to that 0.8 or 20 gauge. Try to get them coming out. If they are symmetrical on your guitar of choice, try to get them symmetrical at this stage as well. And what we're going to do with each one of those in turn is to wrap them in exactly the same way we added that bridge wire to the body. We're going to just wrap around the outside of the headstock. So I'll just show you one of those. What I might do is just put a bit of a hard angle, like so. So you can see I've got a nice sharp angle there. I might do the same for all of them. If you prefer, you can use your thumbnail and get a softer angle. Whatever makes you happy. They do tend to just sort of come out at a bit of an angle, and then you can face them up. Whatever makes you happy, but leave yourself some space up at the top there. So all I would do here is trim away, to begin with, some of that excess wire just to make my life easier so I can see what I'm doing. And then what I might do is just hold onto that end of that string wire, push that so that I get a definitive angle. I'll just show you what that looks like. Pop that back onto the headstock and then hold that in position whilst you bring that tail section around. And just again, if you go slowly, it'll all be absolutely super. So because this is a slightly finer gauge wire, I'm going to bring that all the way around and over the top. And just make sure that that sits as flush as possible to that beautifully hammered frame that we made earlier. Give that a bit of a squish, and I'll repeat that with the other 5 strings. So we have our neck in position now, complete with strings and fretboard, and we've anchored all of those strings at the far end. Everything's getting a little bit more stable. So what we're going to do is a classic tree of life design. We're going to add a lot of finer gauge wire twisted around the very base of the pendant, or the artwork if you prefer, and then we're going to turn that into a tree which will cover up that little bit of the connection that we made at the bridge. So let's head back down to the board and start making our tree of life design. So I'm going to be working with 0.4mm gauge wire, which is 26 gauge. And the way I decide the length of the wire is I measure the distance between the bottom of the frame and the top of where the tree is going to reach to. So in this instance, it's where the horn is, or where the neck sets away from the main body of the guitar. So I will measure that 1, 2, 3, 4 times, give or take. So I'm working with approximately 9 to 10 inch lengths for my guitar, and I'm going to work with 9 of them. I'm going to begin by finding the centre of that finer wire and threading that through the base of the guitar like so. So it's halfway along the finer gauge wire. I'm just going to wrap that all the way around once and then back in the opposite direction. So if I just scooch that up really neatly with my nails, you can see that I've wrapped all the way around once and connected, and then there's 2 wires coming away from that single piece. And I'm going to do that with each of my 9 pieces of cut wire, all the same length and size. So this is just my classic tree of life design with beads. I've got my 9 pieces of wire attached down at the base of the design. And I'm going to separate them out into clusters of 3. You don't have to have 9. You could go for 8. You could go for 7. Do whatever makes you happy. But if I pull these 3 over to one side And then let's go for 3 on the other side. Just get them out of the way a little bit. What we're going to do is to turn each of those into a little cluster in of itself. So at the moment, it doesn't matter that the wires are pointing in completely the wrong direction. I just like to have a little bit of space between each of those little root sections. And I'm going to make sure there is space and then grip that whilst I draw all of those. There's now 6 wires from 3 individual wraps. Grip those individual wraps, and then I'm just going to do a twist like you're turning a key in a lock, going in the same direction. I don't want to go too far along, so I'm just going to open that out just to make it easier to get in there and twist that around. So I've got 3 connected pieces like so, and I'll repeat on either side. Now, you may already have your preferred way of creating a tree of life, in which case just go your own way. But what I'm going to do is got my 3 little clusters. I'm going to flip those over so they're facing in the correct direction now. If you wrap incredibly tightly, because we hammered that wire and it's now more of an oval to square profile rather than round, you may need to just help those wires to just turn back over. It shouldn't be an issue because it's a nice light wire. So I'm just going to scooch those up together, and then I'm going to handle my fine wire as little as possible, to be perfectly honest, and I'm just going to group those 3 groups of 3 together and make a mega trunk up the middle. So again, it's like twisting a key. You're always moving in the same direction, and you can have your trunk as straight or as wizened and curly as you like. Now, you are able to get in there and add a little bit of detail to those roots. You can individually separate them out if you wish to and just put a bit of a kink in them. This is artistic again, so you take your time, you make that however you want it to appear. Now, I quite like having trunks of trees that are all bendy like a witchy tree. So if you want to do that, we're just going to make a little bit more of a trunk first, bring those wires together. It can help you to get purchase with your fingertips if you just open some of those wires out a little bit at the top, so you've got a flatter surface to grip. So let's just open those out. If they get knotted together, it doesn't really matter. Just gives you an opportunity to tighten that up slightly. So once you've got that slightly tighter, if you want to go for that witchy tree effect, I'm just going to bend that trunk around using my bent chain nose pliers. So I quite like that to go on a bit of a journey. It can be whatever kind of tree you want it to be. That's just an example of what you might like to work with. So I'm just going to make sure that I'm working on the correct side. So you can see the zigzags are much more visible on the underside, plus the cut is on the wrong side. Flip it back over, you can see we're on the side that we want to be working with, where those straight lines are more visible and those finer diagonal lines are a little bit less visible on the rear side. So as I mentioned earlier, with the fretboard, you can absolutely play around with spacing to your heart's content. I am just working with kind of an inspired by guitar design. So as with my standard tree of life designs, what I tend to do is gather those wires together and then bring a few away at a time. Maybe I will twist a little bit more on the larger section just here. And then I'll bring that around and then probably separate that out into 2 different bunches. I'll have one going slightly more up the middle. You can squitch that down if you need to, and then the first section that I brought away I might separate into, sorry about the scratching noise of the wire, might separate that into 2 little bunches. Now if you're very, very soft with your grip, you can use your pliers to help you make those twists and turns. If you crush your wires at this stage, it can snap some of those wires off. So it's kind of best to start with a few more wires than you want, just in case you get a little bit grip happy. But the idea is you either do it by hand or you just go a little softer. So once you've got to the end of your clusters, you can start separating those wires out a little bit more. You can have them coming off in 2s if you want, or 3s and 1s. However you normally do your tree of life. If this is your first tree of life design, I've got several on this channel which refer to different ways that you can do. There's skeleton trees, there's beaded trees, there's even ones on the front of a cabochon. So however you would normally go about it, make yourself happy. So because this is my first little branching out bit, I'm just going to draw that around in a not straight line. And as I said, just be cautious when you're using pliers to help you do this, that you don't accidentally snap any of those wires. So when you're ready, you can start adding on your chosen beads. So I've taken some time to develop a tree which is going to be able to hold some beads, specifically over the bridge area where we added that mechanical connection. So in terms of beads, you can use really whatever you fancy. Small beads do tend to work better because you can get them to sit however you want them to. I've got some lovely 3.5mm faceted Amazonite on this example piece, but I think I might use some 2mm thunder beads. Beautiful little faceted autumnal colour. So all you will do is add them on and then wind your wire 2 or 3 times around the outside, remembering that we're looking to cluster mostly over that mechanical connection point. So once you've taken some time to set up your tree exactly how you want it to be, mine's quite a wizened old witchy tree with lots of twists and turns, you're going to need to think about adding some beads. So the smaller the better, and usually chip beads are a really good call. I've just sent all of my chip beads to a friend. I've managed to find some 3mm tiger's eye and hawk's eye mixed faceted round beads, about 3mm I think, and I've just pre-threaded some onto this first piece of wire. I'm actually terrible at threading beads on, it's very boring to watch. So all you'll do is you'll take each of those branches to the edge of the frame, and I would say stick with the same number of wraps each time. So what I tend to do is start by wrapping around at least 3 times. But what I might do is leave the wires on until I've loaded all of those separate little wires up with more beads. And if I have space to wrap around a 4th or a 5th time on all of those wires, I will absolutely do that. If I don't have the space to do it, I'll trim them all away at that 3 wrap stage. So just keep going until you've built up a lovely tree and you've added on the wires to the frames, and you absolutely can add them around this little section here. But what you might need to do is just pull the wire away underneath after you've taken, let's just grab one of these wires, I'll explain what I mean. So pop a few beads on. You can post the wire through the gap down here at the bridge, but when you've wrapped that around a couple of times, you can draw the tail underneath, take it out to the edge and tie off at the edge as well, and in that way you know it's going to be ultra secure. So I'll meet you back here in a little while once I've added all of my beads. So it looks like a bit of a weird hairy thing at the moment. So what I have done is I've threaded on the beads onto each of those strands of wire emanating from the trunk of the tree. I've made space to wrap 5 times around the frame wire that we made. And what I'm going to do is to bring that wire all the way around the back and just trim it as neatly as possible with my flush cutters. And then we will move on to the last segment of today's tutorial. So with my trees on the Amazonite and on the Tiger's Eye and Hawk's Eye piece, I have made them a little bit more 3D. I've layered some of the strands over the top. I really love that in a Tree of Life design, but obviously you can do that differently if you desire. I've left a little bit more of the neck and frets showing on this piece that I have in my hands right now. And now we're just going to add on a bail up at the top. Now I did one of these a few weeks ago. There is a separate video which I will link in today's tutorial as well, called Add a Bail, and you can find out how to make this very simplistic stylized spiral bail addition. So what we're going to do is just undo that little bit of scrap wire we had earlier on, just holding everything in place whilst we made all of our strings line up. Just undo all of that and pop it in the scrap pot. That's pretty much unusable now. And we'll be adding in some more 0.4 or 26 gauge wire. Now you don't need a huge amount, to be honest, probably only about 6 inches or so is necessary. However, do use fresh wire for this because you want it to be nice and strong and flexible. So what I'm going to do, like I said earlier on, you could make this end section into something else. I'm going to repeat the piece I made over here, which is just a very simplistic design. So I'm going to trim away just the piece I want to trim, bearing in mind that has been slightly hammered. You may need to just play with it to make sure that it sits flat. So do take your time, and what I'm going to do is begin by just bringing these two pieces together, and then I'll be adding on the bail in the traditional add a bail design. So if I just pop half of my wire through like so, what I think I'll do is I'll just post the end through so that I'm circling just around the upper section up at the top of the guitar headstock. And the reason I do one of those to begin with is it means that those two sections of wire, the upper and the lower, can't get too close together. If you start banding them together straight away, and by that I mean wrapping the top and the bottom one together, what you then struggle to do is get a piece of wire in between them. So let's now just push that down the rear side and out of the way. And what we're going to do is just add on that bail. So I've got a little spiral and I want that to sit. Let's have a look. Is that the right way around? Yes, it is. So my finer gauge wire was underneath the headstock of the guitar, so it needed to go underneath that spiral section, bring that all the way through, and then it's just a case of doing an attractive pattern that you enjoy. So I'm going to take that one all the way through that gap again, so that I've got one wrap connecting the adder bail to the top of the headstock, and then I think I'll pop that wire up between and replicate what I have on the left of that start point. So if I post the wire down, I'll then have one wrap around just the upper part of the headstock. That should slide back through. And then I'll wrap once around the upper and the lower headstock sections. And I might just repeat that pattern as I go along. So the next one would be just around the upper part of the headstock. And then I will wrap again onto that add a bail. It's easy enough to just slide that up inside the spiral and bring it back down. And then I will just repeat that pattern all the way along. Now you may have a different way that you want to add a bail on, absolutely fine. Do what makes you happy. But that is the nuts and bolts of the design of the Guitar Tree of Life pendant tutorial for today. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed today's tutorial. I'll take a photograph of those two projects side by side. You can see which one you prefer, and hopefully you will enjoy giving that a go. Have yourself a beautiful day. Do please consider dropping a like and a comment on today's video, as it helps me be seen by the wider community, and consider adding a subscription if you'd like weekly content helping you with beginner to intermediate wire, jewellery and art projects. Have a lovely day. Bye for now.